The day my husband asked me to smile through his betrayal, I thought he wanted one last act of kindness after 40 years of marriage. I was wrong. A week later, I walked into the courtroom wearing that very smile. Michael glanced at me with quiet confidence, certain I would cry, apologize, or simply give up. But when the judge asked if I was ready to begin, I looked straight at my husband and smiled even wider. That was the exact moment he realized I knew far more than he ever imagined, and there was no turning back. If my story reminds you that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, I'd love for you to leave a like. And before we begin, tell me in the comments, what would you have done if the person you trusted most betrayed you? Also let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. If stories of resilience, justice, and second chances speak to your heart, I hope you'll subscribe and join me for the rest of this journey. People often ask when a marriage begins to fall apart. They expect a dramatic answer, a screaming match, a slammed door, a confession whispered over candlelight. But that wasn't how mine happened. Looking back now, I think a marriage usually begins unraveling long before either person admits it. The signs are quiet. They're tucked inside ordinary mornings, forgotten conversations, and empty chairs across the dinner table. My name is Lorraine Dean. I'm 62 years old, and until recently, I believed I had one of those marriages people admired. Michael and I met during my sophomore year at Ohio State University. I was studying elementary education because I'd always loved children and books. Michael was majoring in finance. He wasn't the loudest man in any room, but he had a confidence that made people naturally listen when he spoke. He smiled easily, remembered everyone's name, and somehow managed to make every person feel important. He made me feel important. We married 2 years after graduation in a small church outside Columbus, Ohio. Neither of us came from wealthy families. My father worked at a manufacturing plant until arthritis forced him into early retirement. My mother spent her life raising 4 children. Michael's parents owned a neighborhood hardware store that barely survived the recession during the early 80s. Everything we built together. At least that's what I believed. Michael started as a junior financial advisor at a local investment firm. The hours were long, and the pay wasn't impressive at first. I accepted a position teaching 2nd grade while he worked late evenings trying to establish himself. There were years when we barely saw each other. I'd wake before sunrise to prepare lesson plans while he left before breakfast, wearing neatly pressed suits. I'd grade spelling tests after dinner while he sat at the kitchen table reviewing financial reports. Some nights we were so exhausted that we'd simply smile at each other before falling asleep. Back then, those smiles meant something. When Emily was born, everything changed. Childcare cost more than we expected. Michael's career was finally taking off, and together we made what seemed like the sensible decision. I left teaching. "It'll only be for a few years," Michael promised as we packed my classroom into cardboard boxes. I believed him. Those few years quietly became decades. I never regretted raising our children. Emily was curious about everything. Daniel, born 3 years later, inherited Michael's calm personality, but my stubborn streak. Our home became filled with science projects, piano recitals, soccer practices, scraped knees, birthday parties, and noisy holiday dinners. Michael worked harder every year. His clients trusted him completely. Neighbors often stopped us at church just to compliment him. "You're lucky," one woman told me during a community fundraiser. "Your husband helped us retire comfortably." Another couple thanked him for helping send their grandchildren to college. I felt proud every single time. People saw Michael as honest, reliable, patient, the kind of man who always did the right thing. I saw the same man every evening walking through our front door carrying his worn leather briefcase. Or so I thought. Years passed quietly. Emily graduated from college and became a physical therapist in Cincinnati. Daniel accepted an engineering job in Chicago. Our once noisy house became strangely silent. At first, I hated the silence. Then I began imagining everything retirement would bring. Michael often talked about traveling once he slowed down. "We'll finally visit Maine in the fall," he'd say. "You've always wanted to see the leaves." Sometimes we'd sit on our back porch watching the sunset. "We've earned this," he'd whisper. I'd squeeze his hand. I know. I truly believed the hardest years were behind us. When I turned 60, I accepted a part-time position at the local public library. I didn't need the income. I simply missed being surrounded by books and children. Every Wednesday morning, preschool classes visited for story time. Those little faces reminded me why I'd chosen teaching all those years ago. Michael encouraged me. "I'm glad you found something you love," he'd say. It sounded sincere. Nothing about him seemed different. Not yet. The changes arrived so slowly that I almost convinced myself they weren't real. It started with little things. Michael began checking his phone during dinner. He never used to do that. If it buzzed, he'd glance down before turning the screen away from me. "It's work," he'd explain. "I'll answer later." Then came the late meetings, financial planning season, new clients, unexpected conferences, business dinners. Every explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. I wanted to believe every one of them. Sometimes he'd arrive home after 9. His tie would be slightly loose and he'd apologize for missing dinner. "You should have eaten without me." "I did," I'd answer. But the truth was, I often waited. After 40 years together, eating alone felt wrong. I started noticing other little changes. He replaced his usual aftershave with an expensive cologne. He bought several tailored suits, even though he'd recently mentioned slowing down at work. He began exercising before sunrise. "I've got to stay healthy," he'd joke. "Retirement won't be much fun otherwise." I laughed along. Still, something felt off. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. One Saturday morning, I reached for his phone because mine had died. I only wanted to check tomorrow's weather before leaving for the farmer's market. The phone was locked. That wasn't unusual. What surprised me was how quickly Michael reached across the kitchen island and picked it up. "I'll check it for you," he said. He smiled, but it wasn't his usual smile. It disappeared almost immediately. For just a second, I caught something I'd never seen before: nervousness. The moment passed so quickly that I almost questioned myself. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe retirement anxiety was affecting both of us. Maybe I was becoming overly sensitive. Women my age often blame themselves before questioning the people they love. I certainly did. That autumn, Emily came home for Thanksgiving. She hugged me tightly before whispering, "Mom, you look tired." "I've just been reading too late." It wasn't entirely a lie. Sleep had become difficult. Michael spent most evenings working in his home office with the door closed. Whenever I knocked, he'd answer immediately, almost too quickly, as though he'd been expecting someone else. During Thanksgiving dinner, I watched him laughing with Emily and Daniel. He carved the turkey exactly as he always had. He teased Daniel about the football game. He helped Emily wash dishes afterward. Anyone watching us would have seen the perfect American family. Even I almost believed it again. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked downstairs for a glass of water. Michael wasn't beside me. The light beneath his office door was still glowing. I quietly approached, intending to remind him it was nearly midnight. Before I knocked, I heard him laughing. Softly. Not the laugh he used with clients. Not the laugh he used with our children. A different laugh. Warmer. Younger. Then his voice dropped low enough that I couldn't make out the words. Silence followed. When he finally opened the door a few minutes later, he looked startled to see me standing there. "Oh, I thought you'd gone to sleep." "I couldn't," I answered. He smiled again. That polished, familiar smile everyone admired. You worry too much. Maybe I did, so I kissed him goodnight. I climbed back into bed, and I spent the next 3 hours staring at the ceiling, wondering why, for the first time in 40 years, my husband's smile no longer made me feel safe. The sentence that changed my life wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even unexpected. At least, not to the man who said it. For Michael, it had probably been rehearsed 100 times before he finally spoke the words aloud. For me, it split 40 years of memories cleanly in half. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening in late February. Michael called me around noon while I was shelving books at the library. "Can you meet me for dinner tonight?" he asked. His voice sounded unusually formal. "We haven't had a night to ourselves in a while." I smiled to myself. That sounds nice. There's a new steakhouse downtown. I'll meet you there at 6. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. I found myself strangely excited. Life had become routine after the children moved away. A dinner date felt like something we hadn't done in years. I even stopped by the salon after work to have my hair trimmed. Nothing dramatic, just enough to feel pretty again. Back home, I stood in front of my closet longer than I cared to admit. I finally chose the navy blue dress Michael had once told me made my eyes look brighter. As I fastened a small pair of pearl earrings, I caught myself smiling in the mirror. Maybe we'd been drifting because we'd stopped making time for each other. Maybe tonight would be a fresh start. How strange that hope can survive, even when warning signs have been piling up for months. The restaurant overlooked the Scioto River. Michael was already seated when I arrived. He stood as I approached. "You look beautiful." The compliment sounded automatic, like something he'd remembered to say rather than something he truly felt. Still, I thanked him. Dinner began pleasantly enough. We talked about Emily's new promotion, Daniel's upcoming business trip, the unusually warm weather. The server brought bread, then drinks, then salads. The conversation never became uncomfortable. It simply never became personal. Michael barely touched his food. He kept folding and unfolding his napkin beneath the table. I noticed his wedding ring catching the light each time his fingers moved. Finally, after the plates had been cleared away, he took a deep breath. "Lorraine." Something inside me tightened. I've been doing a lot of thinking. Those words never lead anywhere good. I don't know how to say this. I waited. I think it's time for us to end our marriage. For a moment, I honestly believed I'd misunderstood him. The sounds around us continued as if nothing had happened. Silverware clinked against plates. Someone laughed at the next table. A waitress carried a birthday cake across the room while strangers applauded. Everything continued moving, except me. "What?" His eyes stayed fixed on the tablecloth. "I want a divorce." I stared at him. 40 years, reduced to 3 words. "No." It was all I could manage. "No, I mean..." My voice cracked. "This doesn't make sense." "It does. I've thought about this for a long time." "A long time?" He nodded. "We've grown apart. We're different people now. I care about you. I always will. But I'm not in love with you anymore." The words felt carefully polished, almost memorized. I searched his face for emotion, regret, pain, anything. Instead, I found calm. Not peaceful calm, prepared calm. Like someone reading from a script he'd already practiced. "When," I whispered, "when did you stop loving me?" He sighed. I honestly don't know. Maybe years ago. Years. He said it so casually, as though those years hadn't included birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas mornings, hospital visits, family vacations, and quiet evenings sitting beside me on our porch. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't want to hurt you. The irony nearly made me laugh. Instead, tears blurred my vision. I thought we were planning retirement. We were talking about traveling. I believed we were happy. We had good years. Had. Past tense. Michael leaned forward. This doesn't have to become ugly. I blinked through tears. I want us to handle this like adults. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I don't want lawyers. I don't want arguments. I don't want our children caught in the middle. He paused before saying the sentence that would echo in my mind for weeks. I just need you to smile through this. I frowned. What? Smile. Be gracious. We had 40 good years. Let's not ruin everyone's memories. I stared at him in disbelief. You want me to smile? He nodded gently. It'll make everything easier. Easier for who? For everyone. There it was again. Everyone. Except me. He continued speaking as though explaining something perfectly reasonable. We're older. Our friends don't need drama. The kids have their own families. Let's show them we can separate with dignity. I looked across the table at the man I'd shared almost my entire adult life with. He wasn't asking for compassion. He was asking for silence. He wanted the appearance of peace. He wanted me to help protect the reputation he'd spent decades building. He wanted me smiling while my world collapsed. I stood. I need to go. Lorraine. I can't do this right now. He reached toward my hand. I stepped back. For the first time in 40 years, I didn't want him touching me. The drive home felt endless. Rain struck the windshield so heavily I could barely see the road. By the time I reached the house, I realized I had no memory of the drive itself. Only the sentence. Smile through this. Smile through this. Smile through this. I barely slept. Morning arrived anyway. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. Emily. Hi, Mom. Her voice sounded cheerful. Are you okay? Why? Dad called. Of course he had. He said he talked to you. I closed my eyes. He did? There was an awkward silence. Then Emily sighed. I'm so sorry. So am I. Dad said the two of you just grew apart. The words sounded strangely familiar, exactly like Michael's. He said nobody did anything wrong. I didn't answer. He also said he hopes you won't make things difficult. My heart sank. He said that he just wants everyone to stay close. He thinks you both deserve a peaceful divorce. Peaceful. Another carefully chosen word. I suddenly realized Michael hadn't simply prepared for the conversation with me. He'd already begun preparing everyone else. By evening, Daniel called. His message was nearly identical. Dad seems really broken up about this. He told me he tried everything. He said he hopes you won't fight. Fight. Another interesting choice, as though asking questions automatically meant starting a war. Within 48 hours, both of my children believed they understood what had happened. Neither had asked for my side, not because they didn't love me, because Michael had always been the dependable one, the reasonable one, the man everyone trusted. I couldn't even blame them. I trusted him too. 3 days later, Michael came by the house. He stood in the living room looking perfectly composed. I spoke with Emily and Daniel. I know. They're taking it hard. So am I. He nodded sympathetically. I've already contacted a mediator. Already? Another word that caught my attention. Everything seemed arranged, prepared, scheduled, as though my opinion had never been necessary. Before leaving, he looked at me with that familiar, practiced smile. I know this hurts. But please remember what I asked. I said nothing. He placed his hand on the doorknob. For everyone's sake. He smiled. Just smile. The front door closed behind him. I remained standing in the quiet living room. For the first time since our dinner, I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry. Instead, a strange thought settled quietly into my mind. Michael wasn't acting like a man ending a marriage. He was acting like a man trying very hard to control a story. And I had the uncomfortable feeling that I had only heard the first chapter. There is something strange that happens when your life begins to crack. At first you try to ignore it. Then you try to explain it. And finally, when the truth becomes impossible to avoid, you begin quietly gathering the pieces before everything shatters completely. That's where I found myself. 3 days after Michael's visit, I woke up before sunrise, not because I had somewhere to be, but because sleep had stopped offering any real escape. My mind replayed every conversation, every word, every carefully constructed sentence he had delivered. Let's not involve lawyers. Let's keep this peaceful. Just smile. The more I thought about it, the less it felt like a request. It felt like instructions. That morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad in front of me. For the first time in my life, I wrote something that felt almost disloyal. What don't I know? The question sat there in shaky handwriting. I stared at it for a long time. Then I stood up and walked toward Michael's office. I had avoided that room for years. It was his space, his work, his world, his expertise. I trusted him with everything related to finances. Bills, investments, retirement planning. I never questioned any of it. Now, for the first time, I realized how complete that trust had been, and how dangerous it might be. The office smelled faintly of leather and paper. His desk was neat, almost too neat. Files were stacked in careful rows. A framed certificate from the Financial Advisory Board hung on the wall, reminding anyone who entered that Michael Dean was a man to be trusted. I opened the top drawer. Pens, notepads, nothing unusual. The second drawer held client files. Names I recognized from years of hearing stories at dinner. Still nothing. But something about the order bothered me. Michael had always been organized, but this felt curated, like someone had prepared for an inspection. I moved to the filing cabinet beside his desk. Locked. That wasn't unusual either. What was unusual was how quickly I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. A spare key. We used to keep one in the kitchen junk drawer. I walked back to the kitchen, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the drawer. Old batteries, rubber bands, a broken pen. And there it was, a small brass key tucked in the corner. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. 40 years of trust rested in that tiny piece of metal. Then I picked it up and walked back to the office. The lock clicked open with a soft, almost reluctant sound. Inside were rows of neatly labeled folders. Tax returns, investment accounts, property records. At first glance, everything looked perfectly normal, but I forced myself to slow down, to actually read. The first folder I opened contained last year's tax return. I scanned the numbers, Then I paused. Something didn't match what I remembered. Not dramatically, just slightly off. I pulled out the return from 2 years ago, then 3. The differences became clearer. Income streams that appeared then disappeared. Investment accounts listed 1 year and missing the next. Transfers that weren't explained. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Maybe this was normal. Maybe financial documents were always complicated. I almost closed the folder. Almost. Instead, I kept going. The next file contained investment summaries. Some accounts I recognized. Others I had never seen before. Different institutions, different account numbers, different balances. I sat down in Michael's chair. My heart was beating faster now. Why didn't I know about these? We had always discussed our finances. At least, I thought we had. Or had I just listened while he explained things in ways I didn't fully understand? A memory surfaced. Years ago, I had asked about one of his investment strategies. He smiled, kissed my forehead, and said, "Don't worry about it. That's my job." I had laughed. "I trust you." He had smiled back. "I know." The memory now felt different. He hadn't reassured me. He had dismissed me. I swallowed hard and opened another folder. Property records. Our house was listed, of course. But beneath it were documents I didn't recognize. A small commercial property, a condo unit in another city, both listed under variations of Michael's name. My hands began to shake. This wasn't just complicated. This was hidden. I quickly grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of everything, page after page, account numbers, balances, dates, transfers. I didn't fully understand what I was looking at, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not something Michael had planned to show me. Halfway through photographing a folder, I heard the front door open. My heart nearly stopped. Michael. He wasn't supposed to be home. I froze. His footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway. I quickly closed the cabinet, locked it, and slipped the key into my pocket. By the time he stepped into the doorway, I was standing by the bookshelf pretending to read a title. "Oh." His voice carried mild surprise. "I didn't expect you to be in here." "I was just looking for a book," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. He studied me for a moment. "No tea suspicious." "Just observing." "You okay? I didn't expect you to be in here." "I was just looking for a book," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. He studied me for a moment, not suspicious. "Just observing." "You okay?" "Yes." "Good." He nodded slowly. Then his eyes moved just briefly toward the filing cabinet. It was a subtle glance, but I saw it. And in that single moment, something shifted. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about what I might have seen. "I forgot a file," he said, walking past me. "I'll just grab it." I stepped aside. My heart pounded as he unlocked the cabinet with his own key. He opened one folder, then another. Too quickly, like someone checking that nothing had been disturbed. Finally, he pulled out a document and closed the drawer. "Everything all right?" I asked, watching him carefully. "Of course." He smiled. That same practiced smile. But now for the first time, I could see what was hiding behind it. Control, calculation, fear. He walked past me and paused at the door. "Lorraine." Yes, I meant what I said the other day. About what keeping things simple. He held my gaze. "No unnecessary complications." I nodded slowly. "Of course." He seemed satisfied with that answer. After he left, I stood alone in the office, listening to the sound of his car pulling out of the driveway. Then I closed the door, locked it, and pulled the key from my pocket. My hands were no longer shaking. The fear was still there. The hurt was still there, but something else had taken its place. Clarity. Michael wasn't just ending our marriage, he was trying to control what I walked away with, and whatever he had hidden in those files, it was worth far more than honesty. I always believed betrayal arrived loudly, with shouting, with undeniable proof, with something so obvious that you could never question it. But real betrayal, at least the kind that breaks something deep inside you, often arrives quietly. It waits until you're already off balance, and then it reveals just enough truth to make you doubt everything else. 3 days after I opened Michael's filing cabinet, I found myself standing in the parking lot of his office building. I hadn't planned to come. At least, that's what I told myself. In reality, something had been pulling me there all morning. A feeling I couldn't ignore anymore. I sat in my car for nearly 10 minutes, watching people walk in and out of the building. Professionals. Confident. Busy. They all looked like they belonged there. I suddenly felt like an outsider in my own life. Finally, I stepped out of the car and walked inside. The receptionist smiled politely. "Good morning. Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Michael Dean." She glanced at her computer. "Do you have an appointment?" I hesitated. "No, I just needed to speak with him." She gave me an apologetic smile. "He's in a meeting right now." Of course he was. "When will he be available?" "I'm not sure. He's booked most of the afternoon." I nodded. "That's all right." I turned to leave, and then I heard a voice behind me. "Lorraine." I froze. Slowly, I turned around. Vanessa Brooks stood a few feet away holding a leather portfolio against her chest. She looked exactly the way I remembered. Elegant, confident, perfectly composed. Her dark hair fell neatly over her shoulders, and her expression carried just enough surprise to feel genuine. "Hi," she said, stepping closer. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I. I was just stopping by," I replied. She smiled. "You look wonderful." It was a polite compliment, but something about the way she said it made me feel like I was being studied. Measured. Compared. "You too," I said. We stood there for a moment in awkward silence. Then she shifted her weight slightly. "Are you waiting for Michael?" "Yes. He's in a meeting with a client." Her tone softened just a little. "They've been going over some complicated accounts." Accounts. The word landed heavily in my chest. "How long will that take?" I asked. She hesitated. "Honestly, it might be a while. Of course, everything was always going to take a while. Unless it involved me signing something. Then everything needed to happen immediately." I nodded. "Thank you." I turned toward the door again. "Lorraine." Her voice stopped me. I looked back. For a brief second, something flickered across her face. Not guilt. Not exactly. Something closer to discomfort. "I hope you're doing okay," she said. The words sounded sincere, and that was the part that unsettled me the most. "I'm managing," I replied. She nodded. Then after a slight pause, she added, "Change is hard." Change. Such a gentle word for something so destructive. I studied her face carefully. "You and Michael seem to be handling things well." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Her eyes shifted just slightly. "What do you mean, I mean?" I said calmly. "You seem very involved." The silence between us stretched. Then she smiled. "Professional. Controlled. We work closely together." "Of course you do." I nodded slowly. "I see." Another pause, this one heavier. Then she spoke again. "I know this situation must be difficult for you." Situation. Another careful word. I didn't mean for any of this to hurt you. There it was. Not a confession, but not a denial either. I felt something inside me go very still. How long, I asked quietly. She blinked. I'm sorry. How long have you and Michael been involved? Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. I think you should speak to your husband about that. Of course she did. That was the answer people gave when the truth wasn't convenient. I will, I said, but I'm asking you. She looked down briefly, then back up at me. I care about him. That wasn't an answer, but it told me everything I needed to know. I nodded once. Thank you. And then I walked out. The cold air hit my face as soon as I stepped outside. I stood there for a moment, letting it sink in. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It wasn't just a feeling. It was real. And worse than that, everyone else seemed to know. As I sat back in my car, another realization slowly took shape. Vanessa hadn't looked shocked. She hadn't looked afraid. She hadn't even looked particularly guilty. She had looked prepared, like someone who had already accepted her role in a story that had been unfolding for quite some time. Which meant I wasn't just late to the truth. I was the last one to arrive. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the photographs I had taken from Michael's files. Numbers, accounts, properties, dates. And now a name. Vanessa Brooks. I didn't need proof to connect them anymore. The timeline was starting to form in my mind, and it didn't match anything Michael had told me, not even close. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed. Michael. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Hello? Hi. His voice sounded calm, normal. Did you stop by the office today? My heart skipped. Yes. I heard you spoke with Vanessa. Of course he knew. Nothing in his world happened without him knowing. I did. There was a brief pause. Then he sighed. I wish you hadn't done that. Why, it complicates things. Nothing in his world happened without him knowing. I did. There was a brief pause. Then he sighed. I wish you hadn't done that. He sighed. I wish you hadn't done that. Why, it complicates things. Complicates things. I almost laughed. You asked me to smile, Michael. I am trying. Then trust me when I say that talking to my colleague doesn't help. Why, it complicates things. Complicates things. I almost laughed. You asked me to smile, Michael. I am trying. Then trust me when I say that talking to my colleague doesn't help. Colleague. The word felt almost insulting. I asked her how long. Silence. Then what did she say? That she cares about you. Another pause. Longer this time. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? I leaned back in my chair. For how long have you been lying to me? His voice changed slightly, more controlled. Lorraine, this isn't productive. Answer the question. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I closed my eyes. It matters to me. We were already drifting apart. That's not what I asked. He exhaled slowly. I didn't plan for this to happen. Another familiar line, carefully crafted. I met Vanessa through work, and things developed. When he hesitated, that hesitation told me everything. Before or after you decided our marriage was over, I asked. Lorraine. Before or after? Another pause. Then quietly, before. The word settled into the room like something final. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. Thank you for finally telling the truth. I was going to tell you. When he didn't answer. Because there was no good answer. I didn't want to hurt you. He said it again, that same line, as if repeating it would somehow make it true. You didn't want to get caught, I said softly. That's not fair. No, I replied. It's not. We both fell silent. Then he spoke again. I still want us to handle this peacefully. Of course he did. Of course you do, I said, because now I understood. The affair wasn't the biggest betrayal. It was just the most visible one. The real betrayal was everything else he was trying to keep hidden behind it. There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when fear begins to turn into something else. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't soften. It simply changes shape. That was the morning I decided I would not sign anything Michael put in front of me. Not yet. Not until I understood everything. 3 days after my conversation with him about Vanessa, he showed up at the house again. This time, he didn't pretend it was a casual visit. He walked in carrying a leather folder, the same one I had seen him use for client meetings for years. Professional, organized, final. Good morning, he said, setting the folder down on the kitchen table. Good morning. I stayed where I was, leaning against the counter. I won't take much of your time. Of course you won't. You said you wanted to keep things simple, I replied. I do. He opened the folder and carefully laid out a stack of papers. Divorce documents, already prepared, already printed, already waiting for my signature. I've worked with a mediator to put this together, he said. It's fair. Fair. Another word that sounded reassuring without actually meaning anything. I walked over slowly and looked down at the papers. Legal language, paragraphs, numbers, so many numbers. I thought you didn't want lawyers involved, I said. This isn't a lawyer, he replied quickly. It's just a mediator, someone to help us avoid unnecessary conflict. Unnecessary conflict. He slid a pen toward me. If we both agree, this can be finalized quickly. It's just a mediator, someone to help us avoid unnecessary conflict. Unnecessary conflict. He slid a pen toward me. If we both agree, this can be finalized quickly. Quickly. Everything with him suddenly needed to happen quickly. I picked up the first page. I didn't pretend to understand all of it, but I understood enough. The house, split, retirement accounts, listed, but only a few. Savings, minimal. I flipped through the pages again. Something was missing. No, not something. Many things. The accounts I had seen in his office weren't here. The properties weren't here. The numbers didn't match anything I had photographed. I looked up at him. This is everything, not something. Many things. The accounts I had seen in his office weren't here. The properties weren't here. The numbers didn't match anything I had photographed. I looked up at him. This is everything. Yes. He didn't hesitate. That was what made it worse. No other accounts. No additional properties. No. He held my gaze steadily, confident, certain. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything. If maybe I had misunderstood those documents. If maybe there was some explanation I didn't yet see. Then I remembered the filing cabinet, the locked drawer, the way he checked the folders when he thought I wasn't looking. No, I said quietly. What do you mean, no? I'm not signing this. The change in his expression was subtle, but it was there. a flicker of irritation beneath the calm surface. Lorraine, we talked about this. Yes, we did. You said you wanted this to be peaceful. I do. Then why make it difficult? There it was again. Difficult. As if asking questions was the problem. I need time. For what? To understand what I'm signing. He leaned back slightly. It's straightforward. It's not. It is. He tapped the papers. We're dividing what we have and moving forward. What we have. The words echoed in my mind. You mean what you're showing me? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm showing you everything. No, you're not. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything we had said so far. He studied me carefully now. Not dismissively, not casually, carefully. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm asking questions. You never asked questions before. That was true, and we both knew it. I trusted you before, and now you don't. I held his gaze. No. For the first time since this began, the word didn't feel like it belonged to someone else. It felt like mine. He exhaled slowly. You're letting emotions cloud your judgment. No, I said calmly. I think I'm finally seeing clearly. His eyes narrowed slightly. Lorraine, dragging this out won't benefit anyone. He exhaled slowly. You're letting emotions cloud your judgment. No, I said calmly. I think I'm finally seeing clearly. His eyes narrowed slightly. Lorraine, dragging this out won't benefit anyone. It might benefit me. That's not how this works. Isn't it? He shook his head. You're overcomplicating something that doesn't need to be complicated. I'm asking for time. How much time? I don't know yet. That's not reasonable. I almost smiled. Neither is asking someone to sign away 40 years of their life in one afternoon. His patience was starting to crack. I could see it now. The careful tone. The measured words. They were slipping. You're making a mistake. Neither is asking someone to sign away 40 years of their life in one afternoon. His patience was starting to crack. I could see it now. The careful tone, the measured words, they were slipping. You're making a mistake. Maybe, but it'll be my mistake. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he gathered the papers and slid them back into the folder. Think about it, he said. I have. No, you haven't. Yes, I replied quietly. I have. He stood. This doesn't have to become something ugly. I'm not the one making it ugly. Another silence. Then he spoke again. One last time, Lorraine. Don't turn this into a fight. I met his eyes. I'm not fighting. I'm just not surrendering. The word hung in the air between us. Surrender. That's what he had expected. That's what he had planned for. He picked up the folder and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused. Remember what I said? I already knew what was coming. Smile. I didn't answer this time, because now I understood something he didn't. Smiling didn't mean agreeing. It didn't mean accepting. And it certainly didn't mean giving up. After he left, I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time. The house felt different now. Not empty, not quiet, just honest. For the first time, I wasn't trying to convince myself that everything would be okay. I wasn't trying to protect anyone else's version of events. I was simply facing the truth. And the truth was this: I didn't understand my own financial life. I didn't know what I was entitled to. And the man I had trusted for 40 years was counting on that. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table again. the same notepad in front of me. This time, I didn't write a question. I wrote a name. Karen Ellis. I had heard of her years ago. A friend from church had mentioned her during a difficult divorce. Smart, she had said. Careful, not easily intimidated. At the time, I hadn't paid much attention. Now it felt like the most important decision I could make. My hand hovered over the phone for a moment. Not because I was unsure, but because I knew this would change everything. Michael wanted a quiet ending. Simple, controlled, predictable. Calling a lawyer would do the opposite. It would open doors he had worked very hard to keep closed. It would bring questions he didn't want asked. It would expose things he didn't want seen. I picked up the phone, dialed the number, and waited. Law Office of Karen Ellis, a voice answered. Hello? I said, my voice steady. My name is Lorraine Dean. I'd like to schedule a consultation. There was a brief pause. Of course. What is this regarding? I looked around my kitchen. At the life I had built. At the silence that no longer felt empty. It's regarding a divorce, I said. And for the first time since Michael asked me to smile, I felt something close to control. I expected the lawyer's office to feel cold, impersonal, intimidating. Instead, it felt quiet. Not the kind of silence that makes you uncomfortable, but the kind that makes you think clearly. Karen Ellis's office was on the second floor of a modest brick building just outside downtown Columbus. No flashy signage, no marble floors. Just a simple nameplate on the door and a waiting room with 2 chairs, a small table, and neatly arranged magazines that no one ever seemed to read. I arrived 15 minutes early. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I needed time to steady myself. My hands weren't shaking anymore, not the way they had been in Michael's office. But there was still a tightness in my chest I couldn't quite ignore. This wasn't just a meeting. This was a line. And once I crossed it, there would be no going back to the version of my life where I simply trusted Michael to take care of everything. Mrs. Dean. I looked up. A woman in her late 50s stood in the doorway holding a folder. She wasn't what I expected. No sharp suit meant to intimidate. No overly polished smile. Just a calm presence. I'm Karen Ellis. I stood. Lorraine, please. She nodded. Come in. Her office was simple, organized, warm, but not overly personal. Bookshelves lined one wall. Legal texts, financial guides, case files. A large window let in natural light, and her desk sat slightly off to the side rather than directly between us. That small detail mattered. It didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a conversation. Have a seat, she said. I sat down, placing my bag on my lap. Karen settled into her chair and opened the folder. So, she said gently, tell me what's going on. For a moment, I didn't speak going on. For a moment, I didn't speak AK. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I didn't know where to begin. 40 years doesn't fit neatly into a single explanation. My husband asked for a divorce, I said finally. She nodded. When? About 2 weeks ago, AK. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I didn't know where to begin. 40 years doesn't fit neatly into a single explanation. My husband asked for a divorce, I said finally. She nodded. When? About 2 weeks ago. And how long have you been married? 40 years? Her expression didn't change, but I could tell she understood the weight of that number. Has he provided you with any documents? Yes. I reached into my bag and handed her the folder Michael had left behind. She took it, opened it, and began reading. Not skimming, reading, carefully, line by line. The room was silent except for the soft sound of paper turning. I watched her face, searching for any reaction. Surprise? Concern? Anything. But she remained calm, focused. After several minutes, she closed the folder and looked up at me. "Did you sign this?" "No." "Good." The word came quickly, without hesitation. Something in my chest loosened just slightly. "He told me it was fair," I said. Karen gave a small, knowing nod. "They usually do." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I don't understand most of it," I admitted. "That's not unusual." She leaned back slightly. "Tell me about your finances." That question would have been simple a month ago. Now it felt complicated. My husband handled everything, all of it. Yes. Accounts, investments, taxes, yes. And you trusted him? I did. Karen didn't react to that either. No judgment, no surprise. Just acknowledgement. "Do you have access to your financial records?" "Some. And the rest?" "Found some things." Her eyes sharpened slightly. "What kind of things?" I hesitated. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I took pictures. She nodded. "May I?" I handed it to her. She scrolled through the images slowly. Accounts, statements, property documents, transfers. The longer she looked, the quieter the room seemed to become. Finally, she set the phone down and folded her hands on the desk. "Lorraine," she said carefully, "how long has your husband been a financial advisor?" "Almost 40 years. And you are not aware of these accounts?" "No." She nodded once. Then she leaned forward slightly. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Okay. Do you believe your husband has been completely transparent with you about your finances?" The question felt heavier than it should have, but the answer came easily now. "No." Karen didn't look surprised. She simply nodded. "That's what I thought." She opened the folder again, tapping one page lightly. "This agreement does not reflect what I'm seeing here." "I knew it," I whispered. "Yes," she said calmly. "You did." There was something reassuring about that. Not just being told I was right, but being believed. "So what does that mean?" I asked. "It means," she said, choosing her words carefully, "that your husband may be attempting to settle this divorce without disclosing all marital assets." The words sounded formal, almost clinical, but their meaning was anything but. "His hiding money," I said. Karen didn't soften it. "Yes." The room felt still. Not shocking, not explosive, just clear. "What happens now?" She leaned back again. "Now we proceed properly." "Properly?" "He's hiding money," I said. Karen didn't soften it. "Yes." The room felt still. Not shocking, not explosive, just clear. "What happens now?" She leaned back again. "Now we proceed properly." "Properly." "Yes." She picked up a pen and began writing notes. "We request full financial disclosure. We review all accounts, all properties, all investments. And if he doesn't cooperate..." Her eyes met mine. "Then the court will require him to." Court. The word echoed in my mind. Michael had been so determined to avoid it. Now I understood why. "This is going to take time, isn't it?" I asked. "Yes. And it's going to be difficult." She considered that for a moment. "It may become uncomfortable." That was a careful way of saying yes. I nodded slowly. "I can handle uncomfortable." Karen studied me for a moment. "I believe you can." Then she added, "But you need to be prepared." "For what?" "For pushback, for pressure, for people telling you to settle. I thought of Emily, of Daniel, of Michael's calm voice repeating the same phrases over and over again. Keep it peaceful. Don't fight. Smile. They already are, I said quietly. Karen nodded. That's not unusual. Your husband likely presented this in a way that makes him appear reasonable. He did, and you may be seen as the one complicating things. I almost smiled. I already am. She returned the smallest hint of a smile. Then you're ahead of schedule. I let out a soft laugh, the first genuine one in weeks. It surprised both of us. Karen closed her notebook. I want to be very clear about something, Lorraine. I straightened slightly. You have rights, more than what's written in this document, more than what he's offering, and more than what you may even realize. I swallowed. I've never done anything like this before. I know. That's why you came here. She leaned forward slightly. And I'm going to help you? There was no dramatic emphasis, no grand promise, just certainty. And for the first time since Michael asked me to smile through his betrayal, I felt something steady beneath my feet. Not anger, not fear, something stronger, understanding, and the quiet beginning of control. The hardest part wasn't discovering the truth. It was standing in it alone while everyone else continued believing a version of the story that no longer existed. I thought calling Karen would change things immediately, that somehow, once I had the truth on my side, everything would begin to shift. But real life doesn't work that way. Truth takes time to catch up with perception, and in the meantime, perception can be a very lonely place. The first sign came from Emily. She called me 2 days after my meeting with Karen. Hi, Mom. Her voice sounded careful, measured. Hi, sweetheart. How are you? I'm all right. A pause. Then, Dad told me you're hiring a lawyer. Of course he had. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. Why? The question wasn't angry. It was confused, almost disappointed. I closed my eyes for a moment before answering. Because I need to understand what's happening. You already know what's happening, she said gently. No, I don't. Mom, she sighed softly. He said you agreed to keep things simple. I agreed to keep things respectful. That's the same thing. No, I said quietly. It's not. Silence. Then Hez trying to make this easy for you. Easy. I almost smiled. Hez trying to make this fast. That's not fair. No, I said quietly. It's not. Silence. Then, he's trying to make this easy for you. Easy. I almost smiled. He's trying to make this fast. That's not fair. Emily, I said carefully, have you seen the documents? No. Have you seen any of our financial records? No. Then how do you know what's fair? She didn't answer, because she couldn't. I trust him, she said finally. There it was, the sentence I had spent 40 years building. I did too, I replied. Another silence. This one heavier. I just don't want this to turn into something ugly, she said softly. I don't either. Then why hire a lawyer? Because I'm not going to sign something I don't understand. Her voice changed slightly, more distant. I think you're overthinking this. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger. Something sadder. I think I've been underthinking it for a very long time. She didn't respond. I love you, I added. I love you too, but the warmth wasn't there anymore. not like before. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. I wasn't surprised. Michael had always been the steady one, the reliable one, the man who handled everything. To Emily and to Daniel, questioning him felt like questioning stability itself. That evening, Daniel called. The conversation was shorter, more direct. "Mom, Dad told me what's going on. I figured. He said you're refusing to sign the agreement. I'm asking for time. He said you're bringing in lawyers." "I am." A pause. Then, "Why are you doing this?" The same question, different voice. "Because something doesn't feel right. That's not a reason to drag this out." Drag. Fight. Complicate. The same words repeated in different voices. "Daniel," I said calmly, "have you looked at the numbers? No. Have you seen the accounts? No. Then trust me when I say there's more to this." He sighed. "I just don't want you to make things worse." Worse. As if the betrayal itself wasn't already enough. "I'm not making anything worse," I said quietly. "I'm trying to understand what's already happened." He didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. "I've got to go," he said. "Okay, just think about what you're doing." The line went silent. I set my phone down slowly. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to isolation. Not because I didn't have people in my life, but because the people I loved most were standing on the other side of a story they didn't fully understand. And they weren't ready to question it. The next few days followed the same pattern. Friends from church began reaching out, not directly, carefully. "I heard you and Michael are separating. I'm so sorry." He's handling it so gracefully. Gracefully, another word that felt different now. "He told us you're both trying to keep things peaceful." Peaceful. There it was again. Always the same narrative. Always the same tone. I nodded politely, smiled when expected, and said very little, because I was starting to understand something important. Michael wasn't just controlling the finances. He was controlling the story, and he had a head start. Years of reputation, years of trust, years of being seen as the man who always did the right thing. I couldn't undo that overnight. Karen had warned me about this. "People will believe what they've always believed," she had said, "until they have a reason not to." I didn't have that reason yet. Not publicly. Not in a way that could shift perception. So I did something I never thought I would do. I stopped explaining. I stopped defending myself. I stopped trying to convince anyone of anything. Instead, I focused on what Karen had told me. Facts, evidence, time. One afternoon, I sat in her office again as she reviewed new information. Bank records we had requested. Partial disclosures Michael had provided. He was cooperating technically, but not completely. "See this?" Karen said, pointing to a line on one of the statements. "A transfer?" I leaned closer. "Yes." "Where did it go?" "I don't know." "Exactly." She circled the number. "This is where things get interesting. How many of those are there?" I asked. She looked at me. Enough. That word stayed with me. Enough. Enough to matter. Enough to question everything. Enough to change the outcome. "How long has this been happening?" I asked. Karen didn't answer immediately. She flipped through a few more pages. Then she looked up. "Longer than your divorce." My chest tightened. "How much longer years?" The word settled heavily between us. Years. Not months. Not recent. Years. Everything I had seen in that filing cabinet. Everything I had felt. but couldn't explain. It wasn't new. It had been building quietly, carefully, over time. He planned this, I said. Karen didn't soften it. Yes. The room felt still again, but this time it wasn't confusion. It was clarity. Michael hadn't just decided to leave. He had prepared to leave. Financially, strategically, quietly. And he had expected me to follow his instructions, to smile, to sign, to walk away without ever knowing what I was leaving behind. I looked down at the papers in front of me, then back at Karen. What happens next? She closed the folder. Now we keep going, and if he keeps hiding things, she met my eyes, then we keep uncovering them. I looked down at the papers in front of me, then back at Karen. What happens next? She closed the folder. Now we keep going, and if he keeps hiding things, she met my eyes, then we keep uncovering them. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, just steady confidence. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel alone in the truth. I felt supported by it, and even though the world around me still believed Michael's version of events, I knew something they didn't. The story wasn't finished yet. There's a difference between suspicion and certainty. Suspicion keeps you awake at night, replaying conversations and second-guessing memories. Certainty is quieter, heavier. It doesn't ask questions anymore. It answers them. By the time Karen called me that Thursday morning, I was no longer wondering whether Michael had been hiding something. I was waiting to find out how much. Lorraine, she said, her tone calm but focused. I need you to come in. There was something in her voice that made me grab my keys immediately. Not urgency, not panic, something more deliberate. This is important. That was all she said. When I arrived, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She closed the door behind me, gestured for me to sit, and placed a new set of documents on the desk between us. These came in this morning, she said, from your husband's financial disclosure. I looked down at the papers. They looked official. Complete, neatly organized, very convincing. He's complying, I asked. On the surface. There was that phrase again. On the surface. Karen slid one page toward me. Look at this account. I scanned the numbers. It was one of the accounts I had photographed in Michael's office. But something was off. The balance is lower, I said. Yes. How much lower? She pointed to a column on the right. Approximately 70% lower. My stomach dropped. That's not possible. It is. How? She leaned back slightly. Transfers? When? Over the past 18 months? 18 months. My mind immediately went back. What had we been doing 18 months ago, celebrating our anniversary, planning retirement, talking about traveling, while he was quietly moving money? I felt a cold wave move through me. He started preparing before he told me. Yes? Karen didn't hesitate. And he didn't just move money. She flipped to another page. Look here, property records, a condo, the same one I had seen in the filing cabinet, but the ownership details had changed. It's no longer in his name, I said. Correct. Who owns it now? She tapped the document. A limited liability company, which means it's been moved out of direct personal ownership. Why would he do that? Karen met my eyes. To make it harder to trace. The words landed with quiet finality. Not dramatic, not shocking, just true. I sat back slowly. He planned all of this. Yes. How long? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for another file. This is where things become very clear. She opened it and turned it toward me. Emails. Printed. Highlighted. These were obtained through preliminary discovery, she explained. I read the first line. My breath caught. It was Michael's email. His words, his tone, but not the man I thought I knew. We should begin transferring assets gradually. Before any formal separation, minimize exposure. The words blurred slightly as I continued reading. This isn't just planning a divorce, I said quietly. No, Karen replied. This is strategic concealment. The room felt smaller, like the walls had moved closer. I looked up at her. Is this legal? No. The answer was immediate, clear. Then why would he? Because he didn't expect you to question it. That sentence settled deep. Not just as an explanation, as a realization. Michael hadn't just underestimated the situation. He had underestimated me. He thought I would just sign. Yes, and smile. Karen didn't respond. She didn't need to. I looked back down at the emails. At the dates. At the careful wording. At the man who had sat across from me at dinner and told me we had simply grown apart. This wasn't growing apart. This was leaving with a plan, a blueprint, a strategy. And I had been the last variable in that equation. What happens now? I asked. Karen closed the file. Now we escalate. The word felt different from anything she had said before. More direct. More decisive. What does that mean? It means we formally challenge his disclosures. It means we request full forensic accounting, and it means, she added carefully, that this will no longer remain quiet. There it was. The thing Michael had been trying to avoid from the beginning. Exposure. I thought about Emily, Daniel, our friends, the church community, all the people who believed this was a peaceful, mutual decision. That's going to change everything, I said. Yes. And it's going to get messy. Karen held my gaze. Yes. I took a slow breath. For a moment, I felt that old instinct rise up, the one that had guided me for 40 years. Keep the peace. Avoid conflict. Protect the family. Smile. But then I looked back at the documents, at the evidence, at the truth. And something inside me shifted. Not anger, not revenge. Something steadier. Resolve. He already made it messy, I said quietly. Karen nodded. Yes, he did. I leaned forward slightly. Then we don't hide it. No, we don't rush it. No. And we don't make it easy for him. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. No. For the first time, I felt like I was no longer reacting. I was Q-like I was no longer reacting. I was choosing to see, choosing to understand, choosing to stand in the truth even when it became uncomfortable. As I gathered my things to leave, Karen handed me a copy of the documents. Keep these safe, she said. I will. Sing. Choosing to see, choosing to understand, choosing to stand in the truth even when it became uncomfortable. As I gathered my things to leave, Karen handed me a copy of the documents. Keep these safe, she said. I will. And Lorraine? I paused at the door. Yes, this is going to test you. I know. Not just legally. I understood what she meant. My children. My relationships. my sense of who I had been for 40 years. "I'm ready," I said. And for the first time, I believed it. Because now I knew something Michael didn't. His plan had worked perfectly, right up until the moment I stopped following it. Once you stop reacting, you start preparing. That was the shift. For weeks, I had been trying to understand what Michael had done. Now, for the first time, I began focusing on what I was going to do next. Karen called it building the case. I called it reclaiming my life one document at a time. The next phase wasn't emotional. It was methodical. Every morning I sat at my kitchen table with coffee, my reading glasses, and a growing stack of papers, bank statements, tax records, property documents, emails Karen had obtained through discovery. At first, the numbers overwhelmed me, but slowly, very slowly, they began to make sense. Patterns, dates, movements. It was like learning a new language, one that Michael had spoken fluently for 40 years while I simply nodded along. Now I was finally understanding the words, and what they revealed was chilling. He didn't just move money, I said during one of my meetings with Karen. He moved it strategically. She nodded. Yes, before certain dates. Yes, before disclosures. Yes, each answer confirmed what I was beginning to see. This wasn't careless. This wasn't accidental. This was planned. Carefully. Quietly. Over time. "How confident are we?" I asked. Karen didn't hesitate. Very. That word gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. Stability. Not emotional stability. Something deeper. The kind that comes from knowing you're standing on facts. Meanwhile, Michael continued behaving exactly as expected. Polished, calm, reasonable. He sent messages through his attorney. Short, controlled. "We remain open to settlement. We encourage a cooperative resolution. We hope to avoid unnecessary escalation." The words sounded almost polite, but now I understood what they really meant. Settle quickly. Don't look too closely. Don't make this public. Don't force us to explain. I didn't respond. Not directly. Karen handled everything, and that alone changed the dynamic. For the first time, Michael wasn't speaking to me. He was speaking to someone who understood his language, and he didn't like it. "His tone is shifting," Karen said one afternoon. "In what way has becoming less patient?" I wasn't surprised. Control had always been his strength, and now for the first time, he was losing it. A few days later, he called me directly. I stared at the phone before answering. "Hello, Lorraine." His voice was calm, but tighter than before. "Yes, I heard you're requesting additional disclosures." "I am. That's unnecessary." I almost smiled. "It's necessary for me. You're being advised poorly." There it was. Not anger. Dismissal. She's advising me based on facts. Facts can be interpreted. Numbers can't. A pause. "Then, this isn't who you are." The words caught me off guard. "What does that mean?" "You've never been confrontational." "I'm not being confrontational. You're turning this into something bigger than it needs to be." I leaned back in my chair. "No," I said quietly. "I think you chair." "No," I said quietly. "I think you made it bigger a long time ago." Silence. "Then, you're going to regret this." I let that sit for a moment. "Why?" "Because this will affect everything. Our children, our reputation. Made it bigger a long time ago." Silence. Then you're going to regret this. I let that sit for a moment. Why? Because this will affect everything. Our children, our reputation, our relationships. There it was, the real concern. Not fairness, not resolution, image. I didn't create that risk, I said. You did. His voice hardened slightly. I was trying to protect you. I closed my eyes briefly. That's not what this looks like. What does it look like? It looks like you were protecting yourself. He didn't respond. Because he couldn't. After a moment, he tried a different approach. We can still settle this quietly. On your terms, on reasonable terms. I almost laughed. Define reasonable. Another pause. Lorraine? No, I interrupted gently. You define it. He didn't. Because now, finally, I knew the answer. Reasonable meant convenient. Reasonable meant undiscovered. Reasonable meant silent. I'm not signing anything, I said. Not until everything is clear. This will go to court. Yes. He exhaled slowly. Then don't say I didn't warn you. The line went quiet. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time. Not shaken, not upset, just aware. The conversation had confirmed everything. Michael wasn't trying to fix anything. He was trying to limit damage. And now, for the first time, he understood that the damage might not be contained. Later that week, Karen introduced me to someone new. This is Daniel Foster, she said as we sat in a conference room. He's a forensic accountant. Daniel was in his early 50s with a calm, analytical presence. He shook my hand firmly. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Dean. Please, Lorraine. He smiled slightly. Lorraine? He spread several documents across the table. I've reviewed the materials Karen provided. And he looked at me directly. Your husband has been moving assets in a way that suggests intentional concealment. Hearing it from someone else made it feel even more real. How much are we talking about? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned one of the documents toward me. This is a conservative estimate. I looked down, then I looked again. Because the number didn't make sense. It was too large. This can't be right, I said. It is. That's not what he showed me. No, Daniel replied calmly. It wouldn't be. I felt something shift inside me. Not shock. Not exactly. Something sharper. Something clearer. 40 years. 40 years of shared life. And I had no idea. He was going to let me walk away with almost nothing, I said. Karen didn't soften it. Yes. The words settled into the room like a final piece of the puzzle, and suddenly everything made sense. The urgency, the pressure, the constant reminders to smile. Michael hadn't just been asking for kindness. He had been counting on ignore kindness. He had been counting on ignore ants. And now that ignorance was gone. I looked at the documents one more time. Then I looked up. What do we do next? Karen's answer was simple. We finish this. And for the first time since this began it. And now that ignorance was gone. I looked at the documents one more time. Then I looked up. What do we do next? Karen's answer was simple. We finish this. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't afraid of what that meant. The morning of the hearing arrived without ceremony. No dramatic sunrise. No sudden realization. Just a quiet, steady awareness that everything I had been preparing for was finally here. I woke up before my alarm. For a moment, I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt resolved. Not peaceful, but certain. I got dressed slowly, carefully. Not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, just to feel like myself. I chose a simple cream blouse and a navy skirt. Nothing flashy, nothing emotional. My hair was neatly pinned back the same way I used to wear it when I worked at the library. Familiar, grounding. As I stood in front of the mirror, I studied my reflection. I looked older, tired perhaps. But there was something else there too. Something I hadn't seen in a long time. Clarity. And then without thinking about it, I smiled. Not for Michael, not for anyone else. For me. Karen met me outside the courthouse. "You ready?" she asked. "Yes." She nodded once. "Good." Inside, everything moved quickly. Security, hallways, quiet conversations between attorneys, people waiting on benches, clutching folders, whispering to one another. Lives changing in small, quiet ways all around us. We entered the courtroom together, and that's when I saw him. Michael. He was already seated, speaking quietly with his attorney. He looked exactly the same, perfectly composed, perfectly dressed, perfectly in control. Or at least, that's how it appeared. Until he saw me. For just a second, something flickered across his face. Not fear, not yet. Something closer to confusion. Because I was smiling. Not a forced smile. Not a polite one. A calm, steady smile. The kind he had asked for. The kind he thought meant compliance. Surrender. Acceptance. He straightened slightly in his chair, watching me as I took my seat beside Karen. "You look calm," Karen whispered. "I am." And it was true, because I knew something he didn't. I wasn't walking into this room unprepared. I wasn't walking in blind, and I certainly wasn't walking in alone. The judge entered and everyone stood. The formalities began. Names, procedures, introductions. Michael's attorney spoke first. Smooth, confident, he painted a picture that almost sounded reasonable. A long marriage coming to a respectful conclusion. Both parties seeking an amicable resolution. Minor disagreements regarding financial distribution. Minor disagreements. I almost smiled again, because there was nothing minor about what we had discovered. Nothing simple, nothing accidental. When it was Karen's turn, she didn't rush. She stood slowly, organized her notes, and began speaking in a voice that was calm, but unmistakably firm. "Your Honor, this is not a case of minor disagreement." She paused. "This is a case of incomplete disclosure." The words landed quietly, but heavily. Michael shifted slightly in his seat. "Just enough for me to notice." Karen continued. "We have reason to believe that significant marital assets have not been properly reported." The room felt still, not tense, focused. She began presenting documents. Carefully, methodically. Account statements, transfer records, property documents. Each one placed into evidence with quiet precision. Michael's attorney objected. Of course he did. Speculation. Misinterpretation. Lack of context. Karen didn't react emotionally. She simply responded. Then let's provide context. More documents, more records, more connections. I watched Michael as the pieces were laid out. At first, he remained calm, confident, the same man I had seen for decades. But slowly, very slowly, that confidence began to shift. His posture changed. His hands tightened slightly. His eyes moved more frequently toward his attorney. And then, at one point, he looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw it. Recognition, not of me, but of the situation. He understood. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to realize that this was not going the way he had planned. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Dean," she said, her tone measured. "Can you explain these discrepancies?" Michael's attorney spoke quickly. "We will need time to review these documents," but the judge raised her hand. "I asked Mr. Dean." The room went quiet. Michael adjusted his tie, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I believe there may be some misunderstandings. We will need time to review these documents." But the judge raised her hand. "I asked Mr. Dean." The room went quiet. Michael adjusted his tie, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I believe there may be some misunderstandings." "Then clarify them." He hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough, because for the first time since this began, Michael didn't have a prepared answer. "I would need to review the specifics," he said. Karen stepped forward slightly. "We've provided the specifics. More documents, more numbers, more evidence, each one narrowing the space around him." I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, watching the man I had trusted for 40 years try to navigate a situation he could no longer control. And for the first time, I wasn't wondering what he was thinking. I knew. He was realizing that the version of the story he had carefully constructed was beginning to unravel. The hearing continued. Questions, answers, objections, clarifications. But the tone had changed. Subtly, irreversibly. This was no longer a simple divorce. It was an investigation. And Michael was no longer the calm, respected advisor guiding the conversation. He was the one being questioned. At one point, his attorney leaned in and whispered something to him. Michael nodded, but his eyes flicked toward me again. And this time, there was no confusion. No calm, just something quieter, something closer to understanding. He had asked me to smile, to keep things simple, to protect the image. And I had done exactly what he asked. I had smiled. Just not in the way I had smiled. Just not in the way he expected. The judge called for a short recess. People stood. Voices filled the room again. Karen turned to me. "You're doing well." I nodded. "I'm not doing anything expected." The judge called for a short recess. People stood. Voices filled the room again. Karen turned to me. "You're doing well." I nodded. "I'm not doing anything." "Yes, you are." She smiled slightly. "You're standing your ground." I glanced across the room at Michael. He was no longer speaking, no longer directing, just listening. For the first time in 40 years, Michael wasn't in control of the narrative. And as I sat there, calm, steady, and quietly smiling, I realized something important. This wasn't the end. Not yet. But it was the moment everything began to shift. There is a moment in every courtroom where truth stops being quiet. Up until that point, everything feels controlled, measured, carefully presented. But eventually, something breaks through. And when it does, there's no putting it back. The second half of the hearing began with a different energy. It was subtle. You wouldn't notice it if you weren't paying attention. But I was, because I had lived with Michael long enough to recognize the smallest shifts. And he was shifting. The judge returned, and everyone took their seats again. Karen stood first this time. She didn't rush. She never rushed. "Your Honor," she began, "we would like to continue presenting evidence regarding undisclosed assets and inconsistent financial reporting." The judge nodded. Proceed. Karen turned slightly, gesturing toward the stack of documents on the table. We have already established discrepancies in reported account balances and ownership structures. She paused. What we would like to demonstrate now is the pattern behind those discrepancies. Pattern. That word carried weight. It wasn't about a mistake. It wasn't about a misunderstanding. It was about intention. She called Daniel Foster to the stand, the forensic accountant. He walked forward calmly, took the oath, and sat down. Michael's attorney leaned back slightly, watching him carefully. Confident, but no longer dismissive. Mr. Foster? Karen said. Can you explain your role in this case? I was asked to analyze financial records related to Mr. and Mrs. Dean's marital assets, he replied. And what did you find? He didn't hesitate. A consistent pattern of asset transfers designed to reduce the apparent value of the marital estate. The words landed clearly, directly, no emotion, just fact. Michael shifted again. Barely noticeable. But enough. Karen continued. Can you be more specific? Yes. Daniel opened a folder and referenced several pages. Over the past 18 to 24 months, multiple accounts show significant withdrawals or transfers shortly before reporting periods. He pointed to a document. These funds were then redirected into entities or accounts not disclosed in the initial financial statements. Karen nodded. And is this typical behavior? In my professional opinion, no. Why not? Because the timing and structure of the transfers suggest intentional concealment rather than normal financial management. The word hung in the air again. Concealment. Michael's attorney stood. Objection, speculation. The judge looked at Daniel. Is this conclusion based on your professional analysis? Yes, Your Honor. Overruled. The objection fell away. And with it, a piece of Michael's control. Karen continued. Mr. Foster, were you able to estimate the value of the assets that were not disclosed? Yes. And what is that estimate? The room felt still. Even the quiet background noises seemed to disappear. Daniel glanced at his notes. Then he spoke. A conservative estimate would place the undisclosed assets at approximately. He said the number. Clearly, precisely, and this time everyone heard it. Not just me, not just Karen. Everyone. There was a visible reaction in the room. A shift, not dramatic, but undeniable. Michael's attorney leaned forward quickly. We would like to challenge that estimate. You will have the opportunity, the judge said calmly. But for now, let him finish. Daniel continued. These findings are supported by documented transactions account records and communication records. Karen nodded. No further questions. Michael's attorney stood immediately. Cross-examination. The moment they had been waiting for. Mr. Foster, he began. Is it possible that these transfers were made for legitimate business purposes? Yes, Daniel replied. Is it possible that these accounts were structured for tax efficiency? Yes. Is it possible that you are misinterpreting complex financial strategies? Daniel didn't flinch. It's possible to misinterpret isolated transactions, he said, but not a consistent pattern across multiple accounts over an extended period. The attorney paused, then tried again. You're not suggesting illegal activity, are you? Daniel met his gaze. I'm suggesting intentional non-disclosure. The distinction was subtle, but powerful, because it didn't need to be illegal to matter. It just needed to be hidden. The attorney hesitated, then sat down. The damage had been done. Karen didn't speak immediately. She let the silence sit, let the weight of the testimony settle. Then she stood again. Your Honor, we would now like to introduce additional evidence, more documents, more emails, more connections, each one reinforcing the same story. Not chaos, not confusion, A pattern, a plan, a strategy. And as the pieces came together, I watched Michael. Really watched him. Because for the first time, he wasn't watching me. He wasn't controlling the room. He wasn't guiding the narrative. He was reacting. His eyes moved more frequently now, from the judge, to his attorney, to the documents. At one point, his hand tightened slightly on the edge of the table. A small detail. But one I would have missed before. Not now. Because now I wasn't looking at my husband. I was looking at a man whose carefully constructed world was beginning to crack. The judge leaned forward again. "Mr. Dean," she said, "I'm going to ask you again." Her voice was calm, measured, but firm. "Can you explain these discrepancies?" Michael stood slowly. He adjusted his jacket, cleared his throat, and for a moment I saw it. Not confidence, not control. Something else. Pressure. "Your Honor," he began, "these transactions were part of long-term financial planning strategies." The words sounded familiar. Practiced. Safe. Strategies that were not disclosed, the judge asked. They were structured. "That's not what I asked." The room went quiet again. Michael hesitated, just for a second. But this time, it was longer. Noticeable. "Yes," he said finally. "They were not fully disclosed. There it was. Not everything. Not the whole truth. But enough. Enough to shift everything." The judge nodded slightly. "Thank you." She made a note, and in that simple action, something changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively. The narrative had shifted, from disagreement to acknowledgement, from assumption to evidence, from control to consequence. I sat there, hands still folded in my lap, my posture unchanged. But inside, everything felt different, because the truth wasn't just something I knew anymore. It was something everyone could see. And for the first time since this began, Michael's version of the story wasn't the only one in the room. The decision didn't come with a dramatic pause. No raised voices, no final speeches. Just a quiet moment where everything that had been carefully built, every document, every truth, every lie, settled into place. The courtroom felt different that day. Quieter, not because fewer people were there, but because something had shifted beneath the surface. The arguments had been made. The evidence had been presented. There was nothing left to hide behind. I sat beside Karen, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the judge review her notes. Michael sat across the room, still, composed, but no longer in control. That difference was subtle, but unmistakable. For the first time in our entire marriage, I wasn't watching him for reassurance. I was watching him as someone separate from me, someone whose actions had consequences that no longer defined me. The judge looked up. Her voice was calm, measured. Having reviewed the evidence presented, she began the court finds that there has been a lack of full financial disclosure. No emotion, no judgment in her tone. Just fact. Michael's attorney shifted slightly in his seat. The words continued. The documentation supports a pattern of undisclosed asset transfers and incomplete reporting. Pattern. There it was again. Not an accident, not a mistake, a pattern. I felt a quiet steadiness settle inside me. Not satisfaction, not relief, something deeper. Validation. The court will require a full accounting of all marital assets, the judge continued. Additionally, all previously undisclosed assets will be considered part of the marital estate. Michael's attorney stood quickly. Your Honor, she raised her hand. I'm not finished. The room went still again. Given the evidence presented, the court also finds that the initial settlement proposal does not reflect an equitable distribution. Equitable. Fair. The word Michael had used so confidently weeks ago. Now it meant something entirely different. Further proceedings will determine the appropriate division of assets, but it is clear that the current proposal is insufficient. Insufficient. The word landed softly, but it carried weight. Years of planning, months of preparation, all reduced to one quiet conclusion. Not enough. The judge closed her file. Court will reconvene for final determination once full disclosures are complete. The gavel struck, and just like that, it was over. Not completely, not the entire process, but the moment, the turning point, the point where everything changed. People began to move, chairs shifted, voices returned. But I stayed seated for a moment longer, because I wanted to feel it, not the victory. That wasn't what this was. Something quieter, something more important. The truth had been seen, not just by me, not just by Karen, but by the one person who mattered in that room. The one who decided what came next. I stood slowly. Karen placed a hand lightly on my arm. "You did exactly what you needed to do," she said. I nodded. "Thank you." "No," she replied gently. "You did the hard part." Across the room, Michael was speaking with his attorney. His posture was different now. Less controlled. Less certain. And then, as if he felt my gaze, he looked up. Our eyes met. For a moment, everything else disappeared. No courtroom, no attorneys, no documents, just the two of us. 40 years of shared life standing between us. And for the first time, there was no misunderstanding, no illusion, no story being told. Just truth. He took a step toward me. I didn't move. He stopped a few feet away. Lorraine, 40 years of shared life standing between us. And for the first time, there was no misunderstanding, no illusion, no story being told. Just truth. He took a step toward me. I didn't move. He stopped a few feet away. "Lorraine," he said quietly. I waited. I'd like to talk. "Of course you would. Not weeks ago. Not when you had control. Now." "I don't think that's necessary," I replied calmly. His jaw tightened slightly. "This isn't how I wanted things to go." I almost smiled. I know. I was trying to make this easier. For who? The question hung between us. He didn't answer, because he couldn't. "I didn't think you'd—" he started, then stopped. "Look closer," I finished. He exhaled slowly. Yes, there it was, the truth stripped of everything else. "I didn't either," I said. We stood there in silence for a moment. Then he tried again. "We can still resolve this. I'm sure we will. I mean privately." "Of course, always privately. Always quietly. Always controlled." I shook my head slightly. "That's not my priority anymore." His eyes narrowed just a fraction. "What is?" I held his gaze. Clarity. The words seemed to settle into him. Not loudly, but deeply. "This will affect everything," he said again. "Our children, our reputation, our lives." I nodded. "Yes, and you're okay with that?" I thought about Emily, Daniel, the conversations, the distance, the disappointment, and then I thought about the documents, the emails, the years of quiet deception. I'm okay with the truth, I said. He looked at me for a long moment, as if trying to find something familiar, something he recognized. But whatever he was looking for, it wasn't there anymore, because I wasn't the same person who had sat across from him at that dinner. I wasn't the woman who trusted without question, who smiled to keep the peace, who avoided conflict at all costs. I had changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but completely. "I hope this is worth it," he said finally. I didn't hesitate. "It already is." He nodded once, then turned and walked away. No anger, no argument, just acceptance. And as I watched him go, I realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel sad. I felt free. Because for the first time in 40 years, I wasn't living inside someone else's version of my life. I was standing in my own. The days after court were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, not entirely, but quieter. Like the world had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. For weeks, everything had been building questions, tension, uncertainty. Now, even though the case wasn't fully finished, something had shifted. The truth was no longer hidden, and that changed everything. The first call came from Emily. I saw her name on my phone and hesitated for a moment before answering. Not because I didn't want to talk to her, but because I didn't know what version of our conversation I would be stepping into. "Hi, Mom." Her voice was different this time, softer. "Hi, sweetheart." There was a pause. Then I read the court summary. "Of course she had. I figured you might." Another pause. Longer. "He didn't tell us." I closed my eyes briefly. "I know." Her voice wavered slightly. "I didn't know any of it." "I know. I thought—" She stopped herself. I believed him. There it was. Not an accusation, not a defense, just honesty. "I did too," I said gently. Silence filled the space between us. Silence filled the space between us, but this time it didn't feel distant. It felt shared. "I'm so sorry, Mom." The words came quietly, but they carried more weight than anything she had said before. "I should have listened to you." "You were listening to what you knew," I replied, "and what you knew was him." She let out a shaky breath. "I feel like I didn't know him at all. That part hurt the most. Not for me, for her, because that realization doesn't come easily, and it doesn't leave quickly. I think," I said carefully, "we both knew parts of him. Just not all of him." She didn't respond right away. Then, "Can I come see you?" My heart softened. Of course. She arrived 2 days later. The moment she stepped through the door, she wrapped her arms around me tightly. No hesitation, no distance, just connection. "I'm sorry," she whispered again. I held her just as tightly. "It's okay." And for the first time since all of this began, it felt like it might actually be. We sat at the kitchen table for hours, talking. Not about everything, not all at once, but enough to begin repairing what had been strained, enough to understand each other again. Daniel called later that evening. His tone was different too, less certain, more reflective. "I saw the numbers," he said. "Yes, I didn't realize I know." He exhaled slowly. "I should have asked more questions. We both should have." That seemed to settle something between us. Not completely, but enough. "I'm sorry, Mom. I know." And I did. Because this wasn't just my story. It was theirs too. In a different way. A quieter way. But just as real. Meanwhile, Michael's world was changing in ways he couldn't control. Vanessa left. I didn't hear it from him, Of course not. I heard it from Karen. She's no longer involved. Meanwhile, Michael's world was changing in ways he couldn't control. Vanessa left. I didn't hear it from him. Of course not. I heard it from Karen. She's no longer involved, she said simply. Why? Karen shrugged slightly. People tend to reassess when the full picture becomes visible. That made sense, because whatever version of Michael she had believed in, it wasn't the one standing in that courtroom. And when the image cracks, it rarely repairs itself. Friends began to shift too, subtly, carefully. The same people who had once praised Michael's grace now spoke more cautiously. I didn't realize there was more to the story. I hope you're doing okay. If you need anything, the tone had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough to feel, enough to know. And yet I didn't feel the need to explain anything. Not anymore. Because the truth was no longer something I needed to defend. It was something that had already been seen. One afternoon, I returned to the library. Not to work, just to visit. To walk through the familiar aisles. To breathe in the quiet. To remind myself of who I had been before all of this. Before the marriage. Before the betrayal. Before the courtroom. The same children's books sat on the shelves. The same reading corner by the window. The same soft hum of a place built on learning and stories. I ran my hand along the spine of a book and smiled, because for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was stepping back into my own life. Not the one I had shared, not the one I had adjusted to. My own. That evening, I sat on the back porch, watching the sunset. The same place Michael and I had once planned our future. But it didn't feel like a loss anymore. It felt like a beginning. Not a dramatic one. Not a perfect one. Just mine. Emily joined me outside. She handed me a cup of tea and sat beside me. It's quiet, she said. Yes. Does it feel strange? I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. No, it feels honest. She nodded slowly. I think I'm starting to understand that. We sat in silence for a while. Then she spoke again. You're stronger than I realized. I smiled slightly. No, I just stopped ignoring things. She leaned her head gently against my shoulder. I'm glad you did. So was I, because strength doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like seeing clearly, standing quietly, and refusing to pretend anymore. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized something I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about what I had lost. It was about what I had found. My voice, my clarity, myself. The final decision came on an ordinary morning. No tension, no anticipation, just a quiet phone call from Karen as I stood in my kitchen pouring coffee into the same mug I had used for years. Lorraine, she said we have the final ruling. I set the coffee pot down slowly. Okay. Her voice was steady, clear. The court has completed the full review of all disclosed and previously undisclosed assets. I leaned against the counter listening. They have ruled in your favor on all major points. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. I closed my eyes briefly. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to feel it fully. The undisclosed assets have been included in the marital estate, she continued, and the division reflects that. How much? I asked quietly. She told me. And this time, the number didn't shock me. Because I understood it now, not just as a figure, but as something that had been hidden, something that had almost been taken from me without question. Additionally, Karen said the court noted Mr. Dean's lack of transparency in their written findings. There it was, not just a financial outcome. An acknowledgement, a record, a truth that would exist beyond private conversations, beyond explanations, beyond excuses. "Thank you," I said softly. "You earned this," she replied. After we hung up, I stood there for a long time. The house was quiet. Sunlight filtered through the window. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. Because something had closed. Not just the case. A chapter, a version of my life that had been built on trust I never questioned. And now, it was over. Later that afternoon, I saw Michael for the last time. Not by accident, not unexpectedly. He had asked to meet, and this time I agreed. We sat across from each other at a small cafe. Neutral ground. No history attached to it. He looked older. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The kind of aging that doesn't come from time, but from realization. "I heard the decision," he said. "Yes," he nodded once. "I suppose this is what you wanted." I shook my head gently. "No." "What did you want, then?" I thought about that for a moment, then I thought about that for a momenty, because the answer had changed over time. At first, I wanted answers. Then I wanted fairness. Now I wanted the truth, I said. He looked down at his hands. "I should have handled things differently." Because the answer had changed over time. At first I wanted answers. Then I wanted fairness. Now I wanted the truth, I said. He looked down at his hands. "I should have handled things differently." "Yes, I didn't think you would, I know," I interrupted softly. "You didn't think I would look." Silence. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," he said. The same sentence. The same words. But they didn't carry the same weight anymore. "I know," I replied. "But you weren't trying to protect me either. I wasn't trying to hurt you," he said. The same sentence. The same words. But they didn't carry the same weight anymore. "I know," I replied. "But you weren't trying to protect me either." He didn't argue, because now there was nothing left to argue. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he spoke again. "Do you hate me?" The question surprised me, not because of what he asked, but because of how he asked it. Quietly, honestly. I considered it carefully, because this was the last time I would answer him. "No," I said finally. "I don't." He looked up. Surprised. Why not? I met his gaze. "Because that would keep me connected to this." He nodded slowly. "I understand." And I think for the first time, he actually did. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said. I smiled slightly. "I already have." He didn't ask what I meant, because he could see it, in the way I sat, in the way I spoke, in the way I no longer needed anything from him. We stood at the same time. No hug, no handshake, no attempt to recreate something that no longer existed, just a quiet ending. As I walked away, I didn't look back. Not because I was angry, not because I was hurt, but because I didn't need to. That part of my life had already closed. That evening, I returned home and sat on my back porch, the same place where everything had once felt uncertain. Now it felt different, still, clear, peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. Not because everything had been resolved perfectly, but because I had. I had faced the truth. I had stood in it, and I had chosen myself. Not over him, not in spite of him, but simply for me. I thought about the moment in the courtroom, the smile, the one he had asked for, the one he thought meant surrender. And I smiled again, because now I understood something I hadn't before. That smile was never about him. It was about me finally knowing that I didn't need to pretend anymore, that I didn't need to protect something that wasn't real, that I didn't need to stay silent to keep the peace. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is simply see clearly and walk away. There is a quiet kind of strength that many women carry for years, sometimes decades, without even realizing it. It's the strength of patience, of trust, of putting others first. But what Lorraine's story reminds us is this strength is not just about enduring. It's about knowing when to stop enduring and start seeing clearly. Trust is a beautiful thing, but blind trust can cost you your voice, your security, and even your sense of self. Lorraine didn't lose her power overnight. She gave it away slowly, piece by piece, believing she was protecting her marriage, her family, and her peace. And that's something many of us can relate to. But here's the truth. Peace that requires silence is not real peace. Kindness is not weakness. Forgiveness is not surrender. And choosing to stand up for yourself, no matter your age, no matter how late it feels, is not selfish. It is necessary. Lorraine didn't win because she fought harder. She won because she finally chose to understand, to question, and to act with clarity instead of fear. Her smile in that courtroom wasn't revenge. It was freedom. Freedom from illusion. Freedom from control. Freedom to live honestly. And maybe the most powerful lesson of all is this: it is never too late to take your life back. If this story touched you in any way, I'd really love to hear from you. What would you have done in Lorraine's place? Would you have signed the papers or asked questions? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now in your part of the world. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if stories like this remind you of your own strength, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are so many more journeys like Lorraine's waiting to be told.